reasonable.
Thank you. Secretary Noem, the masked officers you sent into the streets of New Orleans are attempting to arrest and abduct and detain anyone that looks like a migrant. I got to ask the question, what does a migrant look like? Do you know what a migrant looks like, sir? Yes? Can you define what a migrant looks like to you?
I cannot.
Thank you. Can you tell me what you think a migrant looks like?
These are targeted raids.
Can you tell me what they look like?
Yeah, you have to stop them. You have to check their identification.
Okay, but can you tell me if you were describing to me as a new $50,000 bonused ICE agent, what does a migrant look like?
You would stop and you would ask them for ID, and
you'd
be on an intelligence-driven operation, which is what these ICE raids are. They're intelligence.
But if you were to say a guy's wearing a red.
Did you watch that? Did you see that pathetic spectacle of bureaucratic doublespeak unravel in real time before your eyes? Watch as the entire architecture of this administration's race-based enforcement regime collapsed under the weight of a single devastating question, because what we just witnessed was nothing less than the exposure of the fundamental lie at the heart of American fascism in 2025, and I need you to understand the enormity of what Representative Troy Carter just accomplished in that hearing room, because this is the moment when the mask slips, and the entire grotesque machinery of state-sanctioned racial terror stands naked and ashamed before the American people. The Trump administration has unleashed masked federal agents across New Orleans in what they're calling Operation Catahoula Crunch, and Mayor-elect Helena Moreno alongside Rep. Troy Carter have demanded transparency amid reports that people across the region, including U.S. citizens and others with work permits, have been detained without cause. And what Carter did in that hearing was strip away every rhetorical shield these enforcement goons hide behind to reveal the barbarism at the core of their mission. Listen to the stammering inadequacy of that response, because officials have said the crackdown appears to be a dragnet focused on people with brown skin, citing viral videos of encounters such as masked agents chasing a 23-year-old U.S. citizen returning home from the grocery store, and you need to absorb the full horror of that reality. The fact that in December 2025, we have armed government agents in tactical gear hunting American citizens through the streets based on nothing more than the color of their skin and the neighborhoods where they buy groceries. This is the logical endpoint of everything the reactionary movement has been building toward for decades, the fulfillment of a white supremacist fantasy dressed up in the language of law and order and national security, and what Carter exposed in that hearing room was the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of the entire enterprise, because when you ask these enforcement officials to define what they're looking for, when you demand they articulate the criteria by which they determine who deserves to be hunted and caged, they cannot answer without admitting to racial profiling so blatant it would make Bull Connor blush with envy. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision that clears the way for racial profiling during immigration raids and sweeps, and now we could see the Trump administration rapidly expand the racially discriminatory ICE practices that have terrorized families, workplaces, and communities around the country, sweeping in U.S. citizens and people with lawful status, which means the highest court in the land has given its blessing to precisely the kind of race-based policing that generations of civil rights activists fought and died to dismantle. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote that we should not have to live in a country where the government can seize anyone who looks Latino, speaks Spanish, and appears to work a low-wage job, and yet here we are living in exactly that dystopian nightmare, because the conservative supermajority on the court has decided that constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure simply do not apply when brown bodies are involved, when Spanish echoes through working-class neighborhoods, when the targets of state violence lack the resources and political power to fight back effectively. What you heard in that exchange was a top Trump security official admitting that yes, he knows what a migrant looks like, but no, he cannot describe it, which is the most damning confession imaginable, because it reveals that the entire enforcement apparatus rests on nothing more than racist intuition and ethnic stereotyping. The Supreme Court ruling allows federal agents broader authority to conduct raids that will target immigrant communities based on factors like the color of their skin and the language they speak, greenlighting racial profiling. And when Carter pressed this official to explain how new ICE agents with $50,000 bonuses are supposed to identify their targets, the man had no answer, because there is no answer that doesn't amount to explicit instructions to profile Latinos, to treat brownness itself as evidence of criminality, to transform entire communities into hunting grounds where citizenship means nothing if your face happens to fit the template of what these masked enforcers consider foreign. Masked agents patrolled a heavily Hispanic suburb in marked and unmarked vehicles, and a convoy of marked and unmarked vehicles slowly drove past gas stations and a Walmart in Kenner, Louisiana, a suburb with the highest concentration of Hispanic residents of any city in the state, which tells you everything you need to know about the so-called intelligence-driven operations these officials keep claiming to conduct, because if this were truly about targeting violent criminals based on specific investigative leads, why are agents setting up dragnet operations outside big-box stores in predominantly Latino neighborhoods? Ahead of the start of immigration operations in New Orleans, immigrants said they were afraid and were taking precautions, with one Honduran immigrant saying he hadn't left his home in 2 weeks because of fear that they would be stopped. And this is the intended effect. This climate of pervasive terror where entire communities huddle indoors while their children miss school, and workers abandon jobs and families go without paychecks, because stepping outside means risking arrest by armed men whose criteria for targeting you cannot be articulated without admitting to racial profiling. The official says these are intelligence-driven operations, that agents would stop someone and check their identification, and this is where the entire justification framework collapses into incoherence, because dozens if not hundreds of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents had been detained or arrested, and sometimes held for days, with the Latino community, especially those with darker skin, being racially profiled, and reporting by ProPublica found at least 170 U.S. citizens who'd been detained or arrested. So tell me how this intelligence-driven approach results in hundreds of American citizens being seized and held in custody if the agents are operating based on specific information about particular individuals with deportation orders. The answer is they're not. They're conducting sweeps based on racial profiling sanctioned by a Supreme Court that has abandoned any pretense of upholding equal protection under law. And what Representative Carter did was force this official to either admit that reality or twist himself into rhetorical knots trying to avoid the admission. Federal agents began immigration enforcement operations as part of Operation Catahoula Crunch, with reports of agents gathering, arrests at home improvement stores, and closed businesses in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods reminiscent of recent blitzes in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Charlotte, North Carolina. And you need to understand that this is a coordinated campaign of state terror, designed not merely to remove people from the country, but to send a message to anyone who looks or sounds or works in ways that don't conform to white nationalist fantasies of American identity. If earlier operations are any indication, ICE and Border Patrol are about to arrest a lot of people who have not committed crimes, as in Chicago, where the vast majority of those detained by ICE did not have criminal records besides illegal border crossing, which exposes the lie about targeting the worst of the worst, about removing violent criminals who pose public safety threats, because when you examine the actual arrest data, the story is very different from the propaganda. Both the FBI and Customs and Border Protection have stationed agents at the Louisiana State Analytical and Fusion Exchange, an intelligence and data sharing center, closely following discussions on Reddit that local residents have used to exchange information about the immigration raging with state and federal authorities, closely tracking online criticism and demonstration, which reveals another chilling dimension of this operation: the fact that the state surveillance apparatus is being deployed not just to hunt immigrants, but to monitor American citizens who dare to document and resist these enforcement actions. Briefings noted that some have accused agents of racially profiling Hispanic areas specifically, suggested agents are not keeping with the mission of targeting criminal immigrants only, and pointed out that critics bring up past hurricanes and the work done by immigrants, and rather than addressing these legitimate concerns about civil rights violations and indiscriminate enforcement, authorities are treating dissent itself as a threat requiring intelligence gathering and potential suppression. What makes this exchange so devastating is how it cuts through the carefully constructed rhetoric about public safety and law enforcement to expose the raw racism animating these operations. When Carter asks what a migrant looks like, he's not asking an abstract philosophical question. He's demanding that this official articulate the criteria by which federal agents are selecting targets in the field, and the official cannot do so without admitting that those criteria are fundamentally racial. The Supreme Court decision has allowed ICE to use broad criteria when making stops, including the type of location at which they were found, the type of job they appeared to work, whether they speak Spanish or English with an accent, and their apparent race or ethnicity, which means agents are literally empowered to seize people based on working in construction or landscaping, based on shopping at certain stores or living in particular neighborhoods, based on speaking Spanish or having an accent when speaking English, all of which are transparent proxies for race and ethnicity. A 22-year-old mother walking home from the grocery store said she was born and raised in a New Orleans suburb when masked federal agents in an SUV approached her, and she told CNN she got spooked by how fast they pulled up, keeping yelling at them saying she was legal and a U.S.-born citizen, that her daughter was in the house and her baby was waiting for her, and federal agents wearing ICE-labeled vests attempted to get closer to her while she did not trust these masked men surrounding her. This is what happens when you empower law enforcement to operate based on racial profiles rather than individualized suspicion. You get American citizens being hunted through their own neighborhoods by masked men who cannot be bothered to verify citizenship before initiating pursuit, who treat brown skin as sufficient justification for interrogation and detention, who create an atmosphere of terror that makes no distinction between documented and undocumented residents, because the real criterion is race. The official's response that agents would check identification misses the entire point, because the question is what causes agents to stop someone in the first place, what features or characteristics or behaviors trigger that initial suspicion, and when the answer cannot be articulated without reference to racial and ethnic markers, then the entire system stands exposed as unconstitutional. Neighbors chased the masked feds across lawns, while filming with cell phones and blowing shrill whistles as a signal for immigrants to stay indoors. And this grassroots resistance represents ordinary Americans recognizing that what's happening in their communities is not legitimate law enforcement, but organized state violence targeting people based on their ethnicity, and they're putting their bodies on the line to document and disrupt it despite a controversial state law making it a crime to interfere, ignore, or thwart federal immigration enforcement efforts, with the FBI and Louisiana State Police saying they will move swiftly to arrest anyone who tries to obstruct law enforcement actions. On the 70th anniversary of the start of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.-led Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott that announced that era's movement for black civil rights, a new and wholly unexpected fight against racism and government tyranny, is rising up in cities from Minneapolis to Los Angeles, and we need to recognize this moment as part of that same continuum of struggle against state-sanctioned racism, because what's happening in New Orleans and Minneapolis and Charlotte and Chicago and Los Angeles is fundamentally the same phenomenon that King and countless others fought against in the 1950s and 60s, the deployment of state power to enforce racial hierarchies and terrorize communities of color into submission. The tactics have evolved, the legal justifications have been updated, but the underlying logic is identical, the belief that some bodies matter less than others, that constitutional protections can be suspended when the targets are sufficiently brown or poor, or politically powerless. Bovino's previous operations in other Democrat-led cities have seen masked, armed agents taking to the streets in unmarked vehicles, a hallmark of immigration enforcement under the Trump administration. With thousands of immigrants arrested, including some without criminal records despite the administration's emphasis that they're targeting the worst of the worst, and during Operation Midway Blitz in Chicago, federal agents shot several people, at least one fatal, which reveals that this isn't just about detention and deportation, but about creating an atmosphere of militarized occupation where communities live under constant threat of violence from heavily armed agents who operate with near-total impunity. Eyewitness videos show an emotional scene in a New Orleans suburb as masked men, some in vests reading Border Patrol, detained a father while his children and neighbors cried out, with multiple agents, many wearing black hoodies and masks, surrounding the man in Kenner. And these scenes of families being torn apart in front of crying children represent the human cost of policies rooted in racial animus dressed up as immigration enforcement. When the official says agents would be on an intelligence-driven operation, he's trying to pivot away from Carter's question, trying to avoid addressing the fundamental issue of how agents identify targets without relying on racial profiling. But Legal Director Homer Lopez of Immigration Services and Legal Advocacy says they're going to target whoever they can, and as the Supreme Court has authorized them, they're using racial profiling as part of that approach, which means the reality on the ground has nothing to do with carefully targeted operations based on specific intelligence and everything to do with casting a wide net through Latino communities and scooping up whoever gets caught. More than 75% of people booked into ICE custody in fiscal year 2025 had no criminal conviction other than an immigration or traffic-related offense, according to ICE records from October through the end of May, which definitively proves that despite all the rhetoric about removing violent criminals and gang members, the vast majority of people being arrested and detained have not committed any crimes beyond the civil violation of unauthorized entry or overstaying a visa. The exchange also exposes the fundamental absurdity of giving ICE agents $50,000 bonuses to meet arrest quotas, because when you incentivize arrests without requiring that those arrests target people who've actually committed crimes or pose genuine public safety threats, you create a system where agents are motivated to maximize numbers rather than focus on legitimate enforcement priorities. Undocumented people who have not been convicted of any crime arrested in raids have become collateral in the larger mission to fight criminality, according to a former ICE official, caught when an officer checks their status and discovers they're in the country illegally, which is a civil not criminal offense, and the term collateral is doing enormous ideological work there, attempting to minimize the reality that the majority of people being arrested are not criminals in any meaningful sense, but rather workers and parents and community members whose only offense is lacking proper documentation. Residents said they were delivering groceries and paychecks to families who were too scared to leave their homes, with only 8 of 140 children coming to soccer practice because many of their parents are immigrants. And this is the social fabric being destroyed by these operations. Children missing school and youth sports, families going without income, entire neighborhoods paralyzed by fear, because the government has decided that immigration enforcement justifies tactics that would be immediately recognized as tyrannical if deployed against white communities. ACLU Louisiana's advocacy director said citizens have already been profiled because of the color of their skin, chased, hunted, and workers have even stared down the barrel of a rifle just trying to do their jobs, and these are not isolated incidents, but the predictable result of empowering law enforcement to operate based on racial suspicion and ethnic profiling while offering legal protection from accountability. The official's inability to answer Carter's question represents more than just an awkward moment in a congressional hearing. It's a confession that the entire enforcement regime lacks any legitimate basis beyond racism. When Congresswoman Adelita Grijalva presented herself as a member of Congress during an ICE raid at a local restaurant and asked for more information, she and her staff were pushed aside and pepper-sprayed by masked agents, which demonstrates that these agents are operating with such impunity that they feel comfortable assaulting a sitting member of Congress who dares to question their actions. And if they treat elected officials with such contempt, imagine how they treat undocumented workers and their families who lack political power and legal protections. Under the Trump administration, communities across the country are being terrorized by a lawless agency, and lawless is precisely the right word because when enforcement operates without transparent criteria, without meaningful oversight, without accountability for violations of constitutional rights, it ceases to be law enforcement and becomes state-sanctioned violence. What we're witnessing is nothing less than the construction of a two-tiered system of rights, where constitutional protections apply fully to white citizens, but can be suspended or ignored when dealing with brown bodies, where the Fourth Amendment's guarantee against unreasonable search and seizure means nothing if you happen to be shopping at a Lowe's in a predominantly Latino neighborhood, or walking home from the grocery store with an accent, or working as a landscaper or day laborer. The administration has said they are detaining people simply based on whether they look like an immigrant, on the language they speak, or where they work, with the Supreme Court decision trampling on the Constitution and enabling racial profiling. And Trump isn't just targeting violent criminals, but sweeping up hard-working people, including U.S. citizens indiscriminately, which represents an existential threat, not just to immigrant communities, but to the very concept of equal protection under law. Because once you establish the principle that government can target people based on racial and ethnic characteristics, there's no limiting principle that prevents that power from being deployed against other disfavored groups. On Friday afternoon in a heavily Latino neighborhood near the New Orleans airport, the cartoon villainous strutting Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino struggled to conduct a sweep through blocks of low-slung apartments, as word that Bovino and his masked secret police were in suburban Kenner spread quickly on chat groups of activists who've played cat and mouse with his agents. And this image of a federal commander struggling to conduct operations because community members are organizing to track and document and resist enforcement reveals that despite all the resources and legal authority being deployed, there remains space for grassroots resistance and mutual aid. The movement is swaying public opinion and encouraging elected officials to get bolder in their opposition, with Mayor-elect Helena Moreno urging transparency and demanding officers remove masks and wear badges, and Minneapolis Police Chief ordering his officers to intervene against federal agents using unlawful force, which shows that local officials are beginning to recognize that cooperating with these operations makes them complicit in constitutional violations and community terrorization. The hearing exchange represents a microcosm of the larger ideological struggle over who gets to be considered fully human and deserving of rights in American society, and Carter's relentless questioning forced the official to confront the contradiction at the heart of the Trump administration's immigration agenda, the impossibility of conducting race-based enforcement without admitting to racial profiling. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund said in a perilous ruling, the Supreme Court threatens to normalize racial profiling and endanger vulnerable communities that are being criminalized because of where they work, how they speak, or what they look like. And normalization is the key word there, because what we're witnessing is an attempt to make racial profiling routine and acceptable again after decades of civil rights advocacy, established that such practices violate fundamental constitutional principles. Carter said he has been in direct communication with the Department of Homeland Security, but has not received the clarity needed to assure the public that civil rights are being protected, noting that lack of clarity only deepens concern, and while city leaders support strong action against violent offenders, he warned that sweeping opaque operations undermine trust and risk violating due process rights, which is the measured language of an elected official trying to thread the needle between supporting legitimate law enforcement and condemning unconstitutional tactics. But the reality is starker than this diplomatic phrasing suggests, because what's happening in New Orleans and across the country isn't just raising concerns about due process, it's systematically violating due process as a matter of policy, treating entire communities as presumptively deportable until proven otherwise, operating from the assumption that brown faces in working-class neighborhoods are legitimate targets for investigation and detention. Minnesota Gov. Tim Walz sent a letter to Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, accusing federal agents of unlawful practices, including detaining multiple U.S. foreign citizens during ICE operations in Minneapolis, and federal agents used pepper spray to push through an angry crowd that blocked their vehicles as they checked identifications in a heavily Somali neighborhood, which demonstrates that these unconstitutional tactics are being deployed nationwide against multiple immigrant communities, with President Trump saying he doesn't want Somalis in the country, and that Somali refugees are completely taking over the once great state of Minnesota, revealing the openly racist motivations driving enforcement priorities. A city council member said he spoke with a young Somali American who was dragged to a vehicle, detained and taken to an ICE detention center, where officials finally looked at his U.S. passport, fingerprinted him, and released him but told him to find his own way home, about 6 miles away in snowy weather, and this casual cruelty toward an American citizen whose only offense was being Somali American in a neighborhood targeted for enforcement reveals the contempt these agents have for the communities they're terrorizing. The official's stammering non-response to Carter's question should be played on repeat across every news network and social media platform, because it crystallizes everything wrong with the current immigration enforcement regime, the way it relies on racial profiling that cannot be defended or even clearly articulated, the way it treats entire ethnic communities as suspect populations requiring surveillance and suppression, the way it prioritizes optics and arrest numbers over legitimate public safety concerns or respect for constitutional rights. When the official says he cannot describe what a migrant looks like after claiming he knows, he's admitting that the criteria are fundamentally illegitimate, that they rely on racist assumptions and ethnic stereotyping rather than individualized suspicion based on specific evidence of wrongdoing. Thousands of parents, teachers, clergy, and community organizers have sought training on what they can legally do when they see an immigration raid unfold, and local resistance efforts have given rise to an informal national network of people looking to each other for lessons on how to push back without confrontation and support their neighbors, which represents the emergence of a mutual aid infrastructure and resistance movement that recognizes these enforcement operations as fundamentally illegitimate attacks on community members. A Presbyterian pastor at the center of a class action lawsuit against the Trump administration was repeatedly shot with pepper balls outside an ICE facility, drawing sharp public criticism over agents' treatment of clergy, Baden, and the fact that federal agents are shooting clergy members with pepper balls for the crime of bearing witness to enforcement operations reveals how quickly this has descended into outright authoritarianism. What Representative Carter accomplished in that hearing was to strip away the veneer of legitimacy from these operations, to force into public view the reality that immigration enforcement as currently practiced rests on nothing more than racial profiling sanctioned by a Supreme Court that has abandoned its role as guardian of constitutional rights. The official's inability to answer what should be a straightforward question exposes the rot at the core of the entire system, the fact that agents are being deployed to hunt people based on criteria that cannot be articulated without admitting to racial discrimination. And this matters enormously, because it gives legal advocates and civil rights organizations concrete evidence of constitutional violations. It gives community members and activists moral justification for resistance. It gives elected officials political cover to oppose federal enforcement operations in their jurisdictions. Carter said he plans to call for a committee hearing to be held in New Orleans, which would force Trump administration officials to directly address these pressing issues, and Moreno said she believes the politics of all this is starting to turn, that even very conservative folks within the city and region are believing that this is a step too far, which suggests that the brutality and indiscriminate nature of these operations is beginning to generate backlash even among people who might otherwise support strict immigration enforcement. because there's a difference between targeted removal of people convicted of serious crimes and terrorizing entire communities with masked agents conducting dragnet sweeps based on racial profiling. The challenge now is whether that growing discomfort can be channeled into meaningful political opposition, whether local officials will risk federal retaliation to protect their residents, whether courts will reassert constitutional limits on enforcement tactics, whether community resistance can make these operations too costly and contentious to continue. The hearing exchange represents a rare moment of accountability in a system designed to operate without transparency or oversight, where enforcement priorities are set based on political considerations and racist ideology rather than legitimate public safety concerns, where agents operate with near-total impunity, protected by qualified immunity and supportive courts, and a political establishment that treats immigration as primarily a security threat rather than a humanitarian issue. What Carter did was insist on clarity, demand that officials articulate the basis for their actions, refuse to accept bureaucratic doublespeak as substitute for genuine answers, and in doing so he created a record of their inability or unwillingness to justify enforcement practices in constitutionally permissible terms. And that record matters because it can be used in litigation, in political organizing, in community resistance efforts, in shaping public opinion about what's actually happening in these targeted cities. This is what resistance looks like in this moment, using every available institutional lever to expose and challenge unconstitutional practices, building community infrastructure to support people targeted by enforcement, documenting violations to create legal and political accountability, refusing to normalize the use of racial profiling and militarized tactics against immigrant communities. The officials' stammering inadequacy in response to Carter's question should fuel moral outrage because it confirms what immigrant rights advocates have been saying all along, that these operations target people based on how they look and where they work and what language they speak, rather than individualized evidence of criminal activity or public safety threats. And that reality demands response, demands that we treat this as the civil rights crisis it represents, demands that we recognize the construction of a two-tiered system of rights as an existential threat to the possibility of multiracial democracy, demands that we stand in solidarity with communities under siege and resist the normalization of state-sanctioned racial terror dressed up as immigration enforcement.